Well, that's quite an intro. Thank you to Daniel, to Sarah, and to the BCCN for inviting me. It's really a pleasure, even though, as Daniel says, I'm sort of on holiday. I'm leaving Berlin to go to Munich to do some more teaching and some more work. So this is fine. I'm really delighted to be here and delighted to see all of you and to make the acquaintance of so many of you through your scholarship and activist academics who are based here in Berlin or otherwise based in Germany nearby. As Daniel mentioned, and this isn't part of the talk, but I will just say that I am a big believer these days in academics being activists as well, and we have formed as a consequence this Critical China Scholars group that Daniel also participates in to think about how to get some sane commentary about China out there, okay? Since the commentary in the media and elsewhere and amongst our politicians is so insane and so warmongering and so Cold War, beholden to the Cold War, that we wanted to do some better work. And so we've been doing that through the pandemic, high tide, the 2 years that we've just endured, and we will continue doing other programming as we go. We also have a web presence. It's called criticalchinascholars.org, and you can find us there. We have a bunch of technological idiots, so our website isn't always as updated as it could be, but we're working on it. Anyway, as we're quite aware, these days mark the formal anniversaries of some profound events. 101 years ago, very unpromisingly, the Chinese Communist Party was founded. 25 years ago, also very unpromisingly, the UK colony of Hong Kong was handed back to the PRC with little to no democratic popular say in the terms of the so-called national reunification. The former event was rather muted in its immediate outcome. The latter was explosive from the very beginning. Both were unpromising, but of course in very different ways. Unpromising in the first case because, of course, it took many years for the Chinese Communist Party to have any real presence in China. And then the other one because it's it has led to this historically retrograde situation that we witness in Hong Kong today. I just want to situate us in our time before we go back, okay? Because the talk I'm giving today was written originally, or the draft of it was written originally for a special issue of the China Quarterly published on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the party's founding. And it was written more as a dirge, a song of lament, rather than as an elegy in celebration. And I've tried, despite all, then, to find ways to recuperate something of hope from the current moment of, for me, real despair in the United States and elsewhere in the world. And so this was my attempt to write a history of something that we might call hopeful. That was based in my attempt to write something about the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party. So I'll just begin the talk, and then hopefully we'll we will definitely have time to have comments afterwards, and to engage in a conversation, which I very much wish to. This is a new direction for me, and so I'm your guinea pigs. I'm trying it out on you, okay? Yeah, you're my test case, okay? I haven't given this talk orally before, so I've only written it. So I'm excited to hear what he might have to say about it. So on his deathbed in 1925, Sun Zhongshan wrote in his last will and testament an exhortation to his followers. The revolution is not yet finished. Comrades, we must continue our efforts. 革命尚未成功，同志仍需努力. In this modern political usage of the term 同志, comrade, Sun hailed into being a collectivity defined through and by a common 同 will, 志, as a principle of revolutionary relations and of future-oriented historical struggle and activity. Sun's exhortation to continue the revolution, actually a series of moments that from the 1910s through to this day has been a site of violent state and social struggle and of repeated interpretive contestation, which is why I wrote the book that I did, that Daniel mentioned before. But Sun's exhortation to continue the revolution through the collective political agency of the relation known as comrade was taken up by communists in China under the aegis of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. While there was already in the early 1920s a circulation of the notion of comradeship derived from the Russian Revolution and its socialist practice, named by the Russian term tavarish, nevertheless, in China, where strict family, gender, ethnic, and cultural hierarchies had served most frequently to mark and regulate social and political relationships, the coming into wider usage of the egalitarian moniker and relation, 同志 or comrade, is of particular note. Chu Choubai, an early Marxist and communist, can be considered an important figure in this history. And I will use his concept of the absolute vernacular, the 绝对的白话, to think about the significance of excavating the comrade relation as a core promise of early political commitments to revolution and communism in China. The emergence of the political relation indicated by comrade can serve as a way to think about the Chinese Communist Party in its origins, even as its dissolution as a political principle of activity after the 1980s bequeathed its ideals, the ideals of comradeship, to the reinvention of the relation as an affectively constructed political community in common for LGBTQ activists in China and elsewhere. In a sinological mode, one perhaps could link the egalitarianism of comrade to the friend relation in the Confucian social order. Indeed, as any introductory lecture on so-called traditional Chinese socio-cultural matters might note, or at least an introductory lecture in the United States might note, of the 5 relations that ideally regulate a well-ordered hierarchical society in the Confucian tradition, the friend relation is the only horizontal one. It was elevated most famously in the modern moment of desired social realignments at the end of the Qing dynasty by Tan Sitong, who was soon to become a martyr to the 1898 petition and reform movement, the Wuxi Bianfa. Tan linked his advocacy of the friend relation irrevocably to the reimagined social relation of Ren, humaneness, a core Confucian value, which he also tried to update for a new historical moment. Yet, however appealing the friend Ren proto-liberal position might be, and it has been hailed more recently as a Chinese cultural solution to capitalism's injustices, nevertheless, comrade is a different kind of naming and a different kind of relation altogether. For that reason, even while Yang Qichao's usage, also dating from 1898, indicates a will towards transformative action, the appearance of the term 同志 in Liang, Tan, or any of its late 19th century, early 20th century iterations cannot be understood in the modern sense of comrade as a political category of collective social activity. For example, Liang wrote, quote, "Those of my countrymen who are unable to sacrifice themselves to save the state are burdened by either their families or their own bodies. I wish to proclaim the following. We cannot save the state unless we are prepared for our families to be destroyed. We cannot achieve our righteous cause if we are unwilling to sacrifice ourselves. Sharing this commitment to sacrifice can be called being 同志 or common-willed," unquote. In Liang's heroic version, 同志 is a collective of individuals acting on a putative common will to die for the state, the guo, as a sacrifice of self and body and or of family. It does not indicate a political organizational principle. Harking back to the notion of individual heroism, the 英雄 or 豪杰 figure so beloved of writers of that time, who wrote enthusiastically about the self-sacrifice of the righteous hero, Liang's 同志 designation is not a collective figure, but rather a collection of heroic individuals. By the same token, someone like Cho Jin in the first decade of the 20th century also was looking to think her way through particular forms of hierarchy to a fundamentally different way of social being. She wrote fictionally of elite women forming sisterhoods to escape the constraining confines of their cloistered lives, looming arranged marriages, and footbound or immobile existences. These sisterhoods were explicitly articulated as exclusive to elite cloistered women, a sociality that maintained the hierarchy between such women and their servants, for example, and that could not yet see any gendered identification beyond the confines of a very particular classed life world. Indeed, it was another decade and a half before the comrade relation would detach itself from an extant state in China and from an extant class relation to expand socially to encompass those from different social classes and backgrounds and begin to become the revolutionary principle of a more radical political collective in action that opposed the hitherto existing states of being, whether social, cultural, economic, or political. A comrade is thus not a friend, neither commonly understood nor in the radical Confucian tradition. A comrade could be a friend, but it's not the same relation as a friend. So it's neither that in the radical Confucian tradition, and even less in the Karl Schmittian agonistic form, in which friend indicates a shifting alliance against a shifting enemy, rather than a necessary revolutionary politics conditioned by a necessary ideological commitment. It is also not merely a convenient substitution for a more formal salutation, nor only a cultural form of politeness. Nor is it a sisterhood or a heroic individual sacrificial position of spectacular opposition. Rather, comrade is explicitly politically disciplined as a collectively envisioned, future-oriented possibility of social organization actively pursued in the present through a new form of relationality. Thus, comrade points to a principle of collectivity that, however affective, also, in Jody Dean's words, shifts us, quote, away from the suppositions of unique particularity, unquote. It can be thought in Chu Cho-bai's terms as an absolute vernacular to which political mobilization for socialist revolution must answer and through which such mobilization must be expressed. The absolute vernacular for Chu is the language of the people who will have made the revolution in their own names. In a discursive genealogy of the usage of tongzhi, or comrade, in Chinese political life, the historian Ma Mingchong has demonstrated that by the early 1920s, tongzhi, comrade, displaced such labels as tongbao, tongxue, jiamei, shongdi, so compatriot, classmate, sister, brother, or xiansheng, Mr. Ma argues that by 1923, comrade was on its way to becoming universally used among communist and nationalist party members, and that after Sun Zhongshan's 1925 usage, with which I began the paper, the label became more ubiquitous. By 1927, Ma notes, most documents issued by the CCP used the phrase 各位同志, all comrades, in relation to those subject to party discipline. And by 1930, the differentiation between comrade and Mr. had become more clearly defined, he says, in social usage, to encompass the social classes who were deemed part of a potential revolutionary totality. As Ma puts it, comrade was no longer merely a salutation, but indicated an adherence to an ism, a juyi. With the Guomindang CCP split in 1927, Ma writes, the guiding principle became, quote, those who believe in Marxism are comrades. Ma's research in party discourse history does valuably explain how comrade became a political identification through the 1920s. This identification was not limited by nationality or gender, although it became, over the course of approximately a decade, an exclusionary form of address indicating loyalty to the Communist Party and its revolutionary principles. It was a principle of Bolshevism that allowed for political work to proceed among like-minded people in a precarious historical context filled with political, capitalist, and imperialist violence. It was a principle among those subjecting themselves to party discipline, and thus it was a principle that necessitated an individual subordination to the party as the leader of a collective revolutionary endeavor. In this sense, it cleared a possibility for political work on the ground, while also imposing a relationship between a central party whose ideological propositions were to be promoted by being disseminated downwards through a party structure. The contradictions and tensions were what made Comrade a valuable principle of politics, that is, the contradictions and tensions between the hierarchical party and the horizontal relationality within the party. And even while, this was a valuable principle, even while it was also a problem in and of everyday individual practice. So Chu Bai, an important Marxist intellectual and early participant in the Chinese Communist Party as theorist, translator, and short-time reluctant party leader, was deeply engaged in conceptualizing non-hierarchical political, social, and cultural relationships for the duration of his adult life in politics and letters. A symptomatic excavation of the possibilities for such relations in China's 1920s and 30s can indicate how a process and practice of egalitarian politics as a social norm and desire, expressed in the concept of comrade, could be conceptualized in the context of a particular precarious moment of history. In this sense, it should be obvious that the ideal of non-hierarchical relations was practiced substantively only rarely at any level of organizational work. And it should also be noted that such an idealized conceptualization thus functioned mainly discursively as an aspiration in the everyday life of the party. Calling each other comrade was both ubiquitous and hence also only selectively practiced amongst those recognized as being worthy of the designation. Nevertheless, we can recall that comrade named a real aspiration, one that seemed in the 1920s and 30s urgent and possible to attain in the now, and as part of a longer-term process of fashioning a better future. I'm going to examine briefly 3 examples of Chu's lived, practiced, and articulated commitment to political non-hierarchy. First, and most abstractly, such a commitment includes his perhaps modest, perhaps overblown, perhaps rhetorical stated anxieties about being superfluous. Chu often maintained that he was a superfluous man, in a version of the 19th century Russian literary fashion. His last piece of writing before his execution by the nationalist Kuomintang in 1935 is famously entitled Superfluous Words, 多余的话. Chu styled himself superfluous because, as he put it, his quote-unquote dilettantish delight in literature ultimately did not square with the Spartan and disciplined requirements of a historically mandated proletarian politics. This conflict for Chu is a materialist problem, not one of abstract sociological categorization or of personal psychological malaise. To be sure, Chu's claims to being superfluous most often have been read as a personal attribute, and more generally, they're read as a stand-in for what is understood to be the always already ill fit between intellectuals and the Chinese Communist Revolutionary Movement. In other words, there's been now a huge corpus of repudiation of the Chinese Communist Revolutionary Movement because intellectuals never should have been there to begin with because they don't fit well, because they're not proletarian, and therefore they couldn't have possibly been correctly positioned to do anything. They should have just been intellectuals. So I'll get to this in a moment, but there's a real repudiation of the cross-class alliance that yields the Communist Revolutionary Movement. And Chu Bai's corpus is often understood to be part of that ill fit. I want to read this otherwise, though. So Chu's lament about the incongruity between his own desires to write and read and the demands of his times was, of course, an articulation of his personal preference to read and write over the discipline and drudgery of political work. Many a Marxist and communist intellectual lamented this clash between the individual desire for self-contemplation and the collective commitment to mass politics and the commitments that required. In this vein, Tanny Barlow sympathetically reads Chu's Last Testament as articulating an abjection in his willingness to die, quote unquote, for logos in translation, unquote. My interest in Chu's self-styling as superfluous is slightly different from Barlow's. I want to think about how the superfluous can be read as a political statement in pursuit of comradeship. In this light, it is possible, and I think plausible, and in fact historically necessary, to understand the superfluous in Chu's discourse as articulating an actually existing materialist problem of how to practice non-hierarchical political relations in a historical moment when hierarchy is the social norm. We can read the superfluous in this way as expressing both the promise and the peril of revolutionary organization and mobilization, the sense of both alienation and obligation simultaneously. This both and problem is most overtly stated in Chu's final text as what he calls a petit bourgeois intellectual's disposition, unquote, in the service of what he calls a historical misunderstanding. By reading misunderstanding not as a psychologizing and sociological fixity, and not merely as expressing an anxiety nor a sense of class identification with a given intellectual position, by reading misunderstanding as a wistful and yet boldly accepted certainty about the loss of discursive hegemony, we can think about the superfluous as a radical gesture rather than one of despair or resignation. That is, in the conditions of revolution, of revolutionary possibility and necessity, intellectuals, I think Chu was recognizing, cannot produce all knowledge, and nor should they pretend to do so. This historical materialist reading presents the superfluous in revolutionary times as being about exile from one's own life. For example, being an intellectual pushed by historical circumstances to not have logos, not have the hegemony of language, to be a communist organizer among peasants or the proletariat, and it's about the experience of misplacement of so-called proper sociological categories in historical terms. In other words, it's about the ways in which one can think about not having the hegemony of language or the hegemony of understanding. The superfluous in revolutionary terms, then, is about the realization that the supposed proper monologic relation of, let's say, an intellectual to a proletarian or a peasant must be actively troubled and thoroughly reconfigured. The discursive and thus lived relation cannot remain at the level of dominant or dominated or elite subaltern. In this register, then, the superfluous is about posing the questions, who can speak and for whom and when. It is not about having the answers to such questions, even if the historical conditions of the superfluous as misplacement also insistently propose that the only possible political position is continually to raise these questions as a core problem of social and political analysis and of mass revolutionary activity. Chu posed these questions without pretending he or really anyone could solve in any definitive way the historical problem of the relation between the petty bourgeois desire to read and write, to have the power of logos, and the historical revolutionary necessity, either discursively or through practice, to form cross-class alliances and to pursue logos in common. One could merely strive, that is, which could be called striving towards the comrade relation. This conundrum, or contradiction, we could say, was the condition both of Chu's possibility and his impossibility as a political actor. What Chu reaches for in raising the superfluous, then, is an acknowledgement of the necessity to try for dialogic relations in politics and discursive forms, to attempt to live life as a comrade across classes and with revolutionary politics in command, albeit with failure always a looming and probable potential. This conviction about the need to work and practice life dialogically and non-hierarchically rather than monologically and vertically, this willingness, in other words, to be alienated from one's so-called proper sociological place in order to politically connect to others, also suffuse Chu's other commitments. So second, we can cite Chu's conviction that the absolute vernacular form of proletarian language forged from the relations established within factories and urban historical spaces from among those who spoke differently accented and pronounced versions of Chinese was the only kind of language reform worth working towards. This concern for language emerged in part through the wider discussions on language reform then ongoing among Chinese intellectuals. It also emerged from Chu's understanding of socialism as being defined first and foremost by the abolition of the regime of private property, and it emerged, as I just underlined, from his conviction that one had to speak a revolutionary language in common with people whose revolution, who will have made their revolution in their own names. So Chu's commitments on language reform required that such reform take into account the equal claims on Chinese as a language of regional languages and pronunciations, rather than override such concerns with a hegemonic standardizing form derived from the northern dialect or from coastal intellectuals' overly Europeanized language forms. This commitment is very much aligned with and perhaps even derivative of his political understanding of socialism as being about the creation of the possibility for the establishment of a regime of property in common. Without getting into too many details of Chu's language reform proposals, and as Zhong Yurou confirms, she's written a book in which Chu's language reforms, concerns feature widely. But as Zhong Yurou's book confirms, Chu's objection to proposals for language reform that took the Peking dialect as the standard was based in his championing of dialect equality, as well as in his opposition to what she calls the hegemony of the national language. In Chu's collaboration with the Soviet linguist Kolokholov, whom he regularly called Comrade, Tongzhi, Tavarish, it is possible to see the abstract commitments to horizontality and language reform translated into concrete personal political practice. This was, I would maintain, a practice of comradeship. Chu's insistence on what we might call the comradely relations in language carried into his conceptualization for the creation of a proletarian language that could transcend region and establish a new universal class norm for socialism in China. For the initial period, Chu was concerned to allow for equal coexistence among languages. As the ideas for language horizontality deepened, Chu's proposal became more enmeshed in the actual class character of language. As Zhong Yurou has documented and argued then, the emergence of the problem of massification, 大众化, in the early 1930s was integral to how Chu conceptualized the problem of Latinization and the reform of language in China. This argument became a hallmark of Chu's debates with Mao Dun and others who wished to maintain an allied relation between intellectuals and the proletariat, where the two classes remained separate and separable. Against Mao Dun's argument, Chu argued that the proletariat needed to be the class into which intellectuals folded themselves, rather than the intellectuals being the class to which the proletariat needed to conform. Chu believed in the capacity of the proletariat's right to self-represent through a language that was theirs and that would become normatively hegemonic. Thus, for Chu, language reform and the possibility of proletariat self-expression in the pursuit of massification and socialism were one and the same. This political, cultural, and social goal cannot be disaggregated without doing epistemic and, more important, class violence to the then active and prospective socialist project of forming a regime of property in common. Well, of course, the ideals of Latinization of proletarian language and of massified socialism in the terms just discussed were never actually implemented and rarely even practiced by their proponents. Nevertheless, for the purpose of delineating the potentials for an emergent comrade politics, it is important to note Chu's insistence that horizontality, the formation of non-hierarchy among spoken languages, and the living process thereby inaugurated, be the principle of creative energy and theoretical ideological commitment. Sorry, that's my phone. Let me turn it off. Sorry. I thought I had done that before, but apparently not. Third, then, in his theory of translation, which was famously debated out through a private and public engagement with Lu Xun, in a series of letters always beginning with the heartfelt salutation, "Dear Comrade," or "My dear Comrade," Chu was clear that rendering one language into another needed to be a collective endeavor, one that created a new language. As Chu wrote to Lu Xun in his 1931, quote, "Translation, in addition to introducing the content of the original to Chinese readers, has another important function, that is, helping us create a new modern Chinese language," unquote. For Chu, language created in and through translation was to become part of a living language of the present. In Tani Barlow's evocative phrase, it was to introduce foreignness and newness into the haunted house of Chinese Hanzi, in a way that produced the possibility not only for communication, but for class and political expression. While the discussion between Chu and Lu Xun is usually understood through the problem of fluency versus accuracy or literalism in translational practice, for my purposes, we can grasp translation in Chu's understanding as a way to activate the principle of collective creation, what the filmmaker Zhang Junli later was to term creative friendship or creative comradeship, as a mode of intersubjective transformation in cinematic production. That was Zhang Junli's version of this. This principle of collective creation animated Chu's most radical proposals about how language and practice were to be merged into a politically egalitarian form that, in turn, informed his consistent attention to the historical, materialist, and philosophical dimensions to words, concepts, and language as spoken, written, and translational forms. Chu's conviction that knowledge, 知识, should not be monopolized as the private possession of the few, and that it had to be liberated, thus to be appropriated socially by all, for all, in the process of political transformation, is the ultimate expression of his commitments to comradely or non-hierarchical socio-political and cultural relations. While this reading of Chu does not engage the complex ways in which he worked through the various conundrums of Marxist philosophy, and that task has been engaged by others, it does address, in a certain way, Chu's belief in the capacity of humans to consciously plan and then strive for a particular future. Finally, then, even in 1927, as party leader, when the pale and weak tubercular Chu was confronted with the necessity to turn to armed struggle in the August 7th Politburo meeting in the face of the Kuomintang and CCP split and the White Terror, Chu pushed for this policy with a clarity that was to doom him personally. He was resolute in his personal sacrifice for the Communist Party and his refusal to purchase his freedom by turning on his comrades as he faced execution, indicating how he lived and practiced his politics to the very end. This can, of course, be seen as a form of heroism, to be sure, but more clearly and radically, it was Chu practicing his self-proclaimed superfluousness, his misplacement and alienation from his proper place as petty bourgeois intellectual in his pursuit of a revolutionary politics of the comradely collective. Were these positions in politics without contradiction? They couldn't possibly be. But it is in the contradiction expressed in the non-hierarchical promise of the comrade relation between an alienation from individual life, a misplacement of that life, and a conviction in the necessity for mass revolutionary collective action that we can choose most radical contributions to communist practice and thinking from the very inauguration of the party in 1921 as a political organization and mass mobilizational principle. So where have all the comrades gone? Infamously, in late 2016, the current core leader of China, Xi Jinping, begged members of the Chinese Communist Party to reestablish the habit of calling each other comrade. The directive issued in on October 27, 2016, superficially exhorted the increasingly hierarchical party organization and entitled and enriched party members to return to a more egalitarian roots as against the emergence and entrenchment of a number of baleful trends. The relevant document says, and I'm going to quote this at some length because it's quite a remarkable list. It says, according to Xi, in the new circumstances, life inside the party apparatus is generally good. At the same time, and for some time already, party life has exhibited the emergence of problems. These include, among many party members, not excluding some high-up cadres, there has been a slackening of ideals, a lack of loyalty to the party, a weakening of discipline, a distancing from the masses, domineering behavior, fraud and trickery, indolence and inaction, individualism, decentralism, liberalism, unprincipled humanism, factionalism, sectarianism, gold worshipping of various sorts, formalism, bureaucratism, hedonism and a love of luxury, nepotism, jockeying for position, buying and selling positions, paying for votes and currying favor, indiscriminate use of power, corruption and enrichment, illegal and licentious behavior, among others. Particularly among high and mid-level cadres, there has emerged unchecked political ambition, lust for power, conspiring and manipulating to enhance power, cliquishness, factional ganging up, power seeking, and other political plotting activities. Of course, life inside the party apparatus is generally good, however.